Behind the morning mist that clings to Florence's ancient stones, a revolution begins not with sword or crown, but with something far more dangerous: the patient accumulation of gold and the quiet architecture of influence. In counting houses where candlelight flickers across ledgers that will reshape the destiny of nations, where the scratch of quills records transactions that span from London's docks to Constantinople's bazaars, a merchant family dares to dream beyond the boundaries of commerce into realms where only kings have tread. The year is 1429, and Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici sits among parchments bearing papal seals, his weathered fingers tracing financial networks that stretch across Christendom like invisible threads of power. He cannot know that his death will pass the torch to a son whose genius will crown kings, or that his great-grandson will become the patron saint of Renaissance magnificence. What he understands, with the clarity that comes only to those who see patterns others miss, is that true authority flows not from birthright, but from indispensability, and that a family bold enough to make themselves essential to popes and princes might write their names across the stars themselves. The streets of Florence shine with last night's rain, stone alleys gleaming beneath a slow-growing brightness. In narrow streets where the scent of fresh bread mingles with the acrid smoke of smithies, where church bells compete with merchants' shouts and the rhythmic hammering of craftsmen, a revolution begins not with swords or manifestos, but with ledgers, florins, and favors too powerful to ignore. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici sits in his modest counting house as the 14th century draws toward its close, weathered fingers tracing columns of numbers that represent something far grander than mere profit. Before him stretch parchments bearing the seals of distant cities: Rome, London, Bruges, Naples. Each document a thread in a web he has spent decades weaving across the known world. His brown eyes, sharp as a falcon's despite advancing years, study not just immediate transactions, but the patterns they reveal, the opportunities they create, the influence they promise. Outside his narrow window, the Republic pulses with energy of a city balanced between medieval guilds and Renaissance dreams. Wool merchants haggle in the shadow of rising towers, while apprentices scurry between counting houses, carrying purses heavy with silver. Guild halls echo with heated debates over taxation and trade routes, their carved facades bearing symbols of crafts that have enriched families for generations. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, deeper currents flow, currents that the patriarch has learned to read like a navigator, studying wind patterns on an open sea. From humble workshops where wool transformed into riches, his family's ascent began through generations of careful dealing, building trust one transaction at a time. While other dynasties boasted of ancient bloodlines or military conquests, this lineage carried different heritage, knowledge of how goods moved, how credit flowed, how prosperity could be transformed from individual gain into collective dominance. Each generation had added layers of expertise, like craftsmen perfecting techniques passed from father to son. Revolution arrives not through violence, but through innovation. Where other money changers content themselves with simple exchange, the elder envisions something unprecedented, a true financial institution spanning continents, connected by letters of credit that allow merchants to conduct business across vast distances without the peril of carrying actual coin. His system enables a Flemish wool buyer to purchase goods using credit established in Bruges, while a Roman cardinal can fund construction projects through deposits made in London. Each transaction strengthens the network while generating profits that accumulate like compound interest. These revolutionary documents become foundation stones of an empire, built not of territory, but of trust. A piece of parchment bearing his seal carries more weight in certain circles than a duke's decree, for merchants know that promises backed by the enterprise will be honored, regardless of wars, plagues, or political upheavals. This reliability transforms paper into authority, creating currency more valuable than gold, the currency of absolute confidence. Papal business proves the cornerstone that elevates regional success into international dominance. When Pope John XXIII seeks a financier capable of managing complex accounts of an institution spanning Christendom, reputation for discretion and competence makes the choice inevitable. Suddenly, money from tithes and pilgrimages flows through his counting houses, while Vatican expenditures from cathedral construction to diplomatic gifts pass through carefully guarded ledgers. Church finances require not merely honesty, but absolute secrecy, for knowledge of papal transactions could shift the balance of European politics. Branches flourish across Europe like seeds carried on favorable winds. In Rome, an elegant palazzo houses operations managing the Vatican's most sensitive business. London's outpost serves English wool merchants whose trade with Flemish cities generates enormous profits. Bruges becomes the centre for northern European operations, its canals carrying goods purchased with credit originating in Tuscan vaults. Each new location strengthens the network, while extending reach into markets previously beyond any single institution's grasp. Success flows from understanding that information travels with gold. Every transaction brings news: which cities prosper, which rulers face rebellion, which trade routes grow dangerous, which opportunities emerge for those positioned to exploit them. Agents function as both financiers and intelligence gatherers, their reports enabling decisions that anticipate market changes by months or even years. Knowledge becomes the ultimate commodity, more precious than any material good, because it multiplies the value of everything else. The Republic itself benefits enormously from this expanding prosperity. As profits accumulate, substantial portions flow toward projects that strengthen the merchant city. Hospitals rise to care for poor and sick, their construction providing employment while demonstrating civic virtue. Churches receive donations, funding artistic commissions, their beauty reflecting well on both faith and benefactor. Public works improve infrastructure, while creating goodwill among citizens who might otherwise view commercial riches with suspicion. Santa Maria del Fiore, the great cathedral dominating construction efforts for generations, receives contributions enabling work to continue when other funding fails. Morning walks through the construction site become routine, with discussions of progress between the financier and master builders whose vision exceeds their resources. His donations purchase not merely stone and mortar, but eternal gratitude of a city measuring worth through lasting monuments. Every florin spent on the cathedral's completion represents investment in reputation, paying dividends long after its donor joins his ancestors. Beyond mere charity, patronage extends into calculated investments in the city's future, promising young scholars receive stipends, enabling them to pursue studies in law, medicine, and philosophy. Artists find commissions, allowing them to develop skills while creating works beautifying the Republic. The most talented receive opportunities to travel, broadening their knowledge while spreading civic influence to distant courts. Each beneficiary becomes an ambassador for both city and benefactor, their success reflecting credit on the wisdom supporting them. Piccarda Boeri brings not only beauty and intelligence to her union, but connections to established families whose support proves invaluable in navigating political complexities. Her relatives occupy positions in guilds and councils, their influence smoothing paths that might otherwise prove difficult for a family whose riches lack ancient pedigree. Love grows alongside advantage, creating bonds strengthening both heart and purse. Subtlety marks political maneuvering, as the patriarch avoids mistakes of rivals seeking office too openly, understanding that real control often flows around official positions rather than through them. Instead of pursuing titles that might provoke opposition, he builds networks of obligation, proving more durable than any formal authority. Loans to struggling nobles create grateful allies, while contributions to civic projects generate popular support, protecting against enemies who might challenge his growing influence. Council meetings, where the Republic's fate is decided, echo, with voices reflecting his indirect sway. Representatives owing their positions to his support advocate for policies favoring commercial growth and political stability. Trade agreements benefiting far-flung operations receive enthusiastic backing from members whose own prosperity depends on maintaining good relationships with their benefactor. Opposition occasionally emerges, but it struggles against accumulated weight of interests profiting from his success. Cosimo de' Medici grows to manhood in this atmosphere of expanding influence and calculated generosity. Paternal lessons emphasize patience over aggression, understanding that lasting control requires foundations built through generations rather than seized through sudden action. Daily walks through the city become tutorials in reading its pulse, which families rise or fall, which projects succeed or founder, which alliances strengthen or weaken. Every conversation, every transaction, every act of patronage serves as practical education in the arts of influence. Evening hours bring strategy discussions between father and son, when account books lie closed and the city settles into quiet rhythms. Hard-won wisdom flows about the delicate balance required to accumulate authority without provoking violent backlash that has destroyed other ambitious families. Cosimo listens with intensity of one who understands that he will inherit not merely riches, but responsibility for preserving and expanding an enterprise, employing hundreds while shaping the destiny of thousands. Letters arrive from courts throughout Europe as international connections multiply, their requests for credit or investment demonstrating how essential the institution has become to continental commerce. Kings seeking funds for military campaigns negotiate terms with representatives treating monarchs as valued but not irreplaceable clients. Cardinals requiring loans for church construction discover that Tuscan financiers understand both spiritual and temporal needs. Ancient names with illustrious histories mobilize political influence to challenge regulations, favoring commercial enterprises over landed estates. As competition emerges from established families, recognizing the threat innovation poses to traditional sources of authority. Arguments echo through guild halls about whether money changers deserve the same respect accorded to families whose ancestors fought in the Crusades or held office in earlier centuries. Response comes not with confrontation, but with demonstrations of indispensability, making opposition seem petty and self-defeating. Lorenzo de' Medici, the elder's younger son, develops into a scholar whose intellectual gifts complement his brother's practical talents. Studies in canon law and classical literature prepare him for roles requiring both learning and diplomatic skill. Correspondence with humanist scholars throughout Italy positions the family as patrons of intellectual revival as well as commercial innovation. Books accumulate in the family library, their precious manuscripts attracting visitors who spread word of cultural sophistication matching financial success. Premises worthy of an institution with continental reach, replace the modest counting house as confidence grows. Master craftsmen create facades, announcing prosperity without ostentation, their decorative elements speaking to those who understand architectural symbolism. Interior spaces balance functionality with beauty, their proportions demonstrating that commercial success need not sacrifice aesthetic sensibility. Visitors from distant cities carry away impressions of an establishment rivaling anything found in established capitals. Fra Angelico receives patronage, enabling creation of works whose spiritual beauty will inspire generations of believers through sacred art commissions, demonstrating devotion, transcending mere civic duty. Religious themes chosen for family chapels reflect not only personal piety, but theological sophistication, commanding respect from clerical authorities. Each masterpiece strengthens bonds between family and church, while creating monuments preserving the donor's memory, long after earthly concerns fade into irrelevance. Endowments ensure care for children whose parents fall victim to plague or poverty through charitable foundations established during these prosperous years, addressing needs that government and guild resources cannot adequately meet. Hospitals expand their facilities while improving medical care for citizens regardless of ability to pay. Educational institutions receive support, enabling them to accept promising students whose families lack resources for formal schooling. Every gift generates gratitude, translating into political support when challenges arise. Experience reveals new possibilities for serving clients, while generating profits as financial innovations continue evolving. Double-entry bookkeeping systems imported from northern Italian cities enable more accurate tracking of complex transactions involving multiple currencies and distant locations. Risk assessment techniques help evaluate creditworthiness of potential borrowers while minimizing losses from defaults that could threaten the entire enterprise. Insurance concepts begin emerging to protect merchants against losses that might otherwise bankrupt careful businessmen. Traditional craft organizations struggle to accommodate new forms of commercial activity, requiring careful navigation of guild politics. Operations don't fit neatly into existing categories, creating jurisdictional disputes that could disrupt business if handled poorly. Patient work establishes precedents protecting the enterprise, while respecting legitimate interests of established guilds. Compromise solutions satisfy most parties, while setting standards benefiting the entire commercial community. Contracts involving parties in different kingdoms require enforcement mechanisms transcending individual rulers' authority. As international law begins adapting to accommodate financial innovations crossing traditional boundaries, commercial disputes need resolution procedures that both sides will accept regardless of their different legal traditions. Standards for currency exchange, credit verification, and debt collection emerge through practical experience rather than theoretical planning. Each successful resolution strengthens frameworks enabling commerce to flourish despite political fragmentation. European conflicts disrupt traditional trade patterns while creating demand for financial services supporting military operations, presenting both opportunities and dangers. Loans to equip armies generate substantial profits if borrowers prove victorious, but defaults by defeated rulers can create catastrophic losses. Strategies develop for managing these risks while positioning operations to profit from whatever outcomes emerge. Neutrality becomes valuable commodity as all sides recognize benefits of maintaining access to financial services, transcending political allegiances. Death stalks European cities with unprecedented ferocity during plague years, testing every institution's resilience. Enterprises depending on personal relationships face extinction when key personnel fall victim to disease, recognizing no distinction between rich and poor. Survival comes through combinations of prudence, luck, and organizational strength, enabling operations to continue despite devastating losses. Recovery efforts demonstrate the essential role in rebuilding communities shattered by demographic catastrophe. Riches enable patronage, attracting artists and scholars whose work will define an entire age as cultural transformation accompanies commercial success. Humanism begins taking root in Tuscan soil, enriched by prosperity, liberating talented individuals from subsistence concerns. Ancient texts receive new attention from scholars, whose research is funded by profits rather than church benefices. Classical learning merges with Christian faith to create intellectual synthesis, reshaping European thought for centuries. Age reminds the Patriarch that even the most successful enterprises require careful succession planning, as legacy concerns occupy his final years. Conversations with Cosimo become increasingly detailed about strategies for preserving what has been built, while adapting to changes that future generations will face. Written instructions accumulate alongside account books, their guidance designed to help successors avoid mistakes that could destroy decades of patient construction. Wisdom earned through experience becomes the most valuable inheritance any parent can provide. Winter of 1429 brings death to the elder, finding him surrounded by evidence of achievements transforming not merely his family's fortunes, but the entire concept of commercial possibility. Account books record assets spanning continents, while correspondence files preserve relationships connecting the Republic to every major city in Christendom. More importantly, institutional frameworks have been established enabling operations to continue regardless of individual mortality. Personal success has become systemic capability. The city mourns a benefactor whose generosity touched countless lives while recognizing achievements bringing honor to the entire Republic through funeral ceremonies reflecting the dual nature of grief and celebration. Processions wind through streets lined with buildings his contributions helped construct, past hospitals his donations supported, toward churches his patronage beautified. Representatives from distant cities attend, their presence demonstrating international respect, elevating local ceremonies into events of continental significance. Something far more valuable than riches passes to Cosimo, a functioning system generating control through service rather than domination. The institution his father created operates according to principles benefiting clients while enriching its owners, creating sustainable prosperity growing stronger with each passing year. More importantly, he receives accumulated wisdom of a man who understood that lasting influence requires foundations built through generations of patient construction, rather than dramatic gestures burning brightly but briefly. Transformation marks the Republic as 1429 ends and a new decade begins. Where once the city depended primarily on wool production and traditional crafts, it now functions as the financial capital of Europe. Gold flows through its streets carrying news from London to Constantinople, while decisions made in modest counting houses affect the fate of kingdoms. Young men throughout Italy dream of careers in finance rather than warfare, recognizing that commercial success offers paths to influence that military conquest cannot match. Prosperity enables experiments in art, learning, and thought that will define an age as Renaissance dreams begin taking concrete form. Scholars arrive from across Europe seeking patronage, enabling research into classical texts and philosophical questions. Artists compete for commissions, allowing them to explore new techniques while creating works of unprecedented beauty. The foundations laid through decades of patient work now support cultural flowering that will illuminate centuries to come. Darkness cloaks the road to Venice, as Cosimo de' Medici urges his horse forward through autumn rain that turns dust to mud and certainty to doubt. Behind him, the towers of Florence fade into mist like a dream dissolving at dawn, while ahead lies exile that could mean either death or redemption. His enemies celebrate in the very palaces where his father once held court, believing they have finally broken the spine of ambition that threatened their ancient privileges. Yet in saddlebags that bounce with each hoofbeat, letters of credit worth more than most kingdoms' treasuries ensure that this banishment will become something far different than his opponents imagine. The Albizzi faction had struck with precision, born of desperation, using accusations of tyranny to turn the Signoria against him in a single dramatic session. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, his silver beard trembling with righteous fury, had stood before the assembled councillors like an Old Testament prophet denouncing corruption. The charges rang through marble halls, where Medici donations had funded artistic masterpieces, that he sought to overthrow the Republic, that his wealth corrupted honest governance, that his foreign connections threatened Florentine independence. But exile proves different when the banished man commands resources that dwarf those of his accusers. Within days of his arrival in the serene lagoon city, Venetian nobles queue outside his residence like supplicants seeking royal audience. His first loan to the Doge purchases not merely financial accommodation, but political protection that transforms exile into strategic advantage. Gold flows from family vaults into Venetian coffers, funding galleys that patrol trade routes while generating profits that multiply with each successful voyage. News from home arrives with merchant caravans whose captains owe their cargoes to established credit lines. The Republic stumbles through crisis after crisis as traditional families prove better at winning council votes than managing continental commerce. Harvest failures drain the city treasury, while their amateur financiers struggle to negotiate loans that once flowed automatically through established channels. Taxes rise as revenues fall, creating the kind of popular discontent that topples governments faster than foreign armies. A single year teaches Florence the difference between inherited privilege and earned competence. Workshops close when raw materials become too expensive to import. Craftsmen flee to cities where work remains available. The construction projects that provided employment grind to a halt as funds evaporate. Even the cathedral stands unfinished, its incomplete dome a daily reminder of abandoned dreams and vanished prosperity. Whispered conversations in taverns and guild halls speak his name with growing frequency as citizens recall how different life felt when family agents facilitated trade, when their loans supported enterprise, when their donations provided social services that government budgets could not afford. Memory transforms recent complaints into nostalgia, while present hardships make past abundance seem like paradise lost through folly. The invitation arrives in October of 1434, delivered by a delegation so humble, their manner suggests supplication rather than negotiation. Venice has taught the exile patience, while Florence has learned necessity, creating conditions for return that reverse the relationship between ruler and ruled. No longer will he operate from shadows cast by others' authority. This homecoming establishes precedents that transform Republican tradition into new realities. Crowds line every street from the city gates to his palazzo, as the most powerful man in Europe returns to claim his birthright. Children who have never known his face cheer because their parents weep with relief. Merchants whose businesses withered during his absence press forward to kiss his hands. Even rival families send representatives to offer submission disguised as welcome, understanding that opposition now means economic suicide rather than political competition. Inside the great hall, where his father once received ambassadors, the returned leader addresses civic leaders, whose faces betray emotions ranging from gratitude to fear. His words carry velvet smoothness that barely conceals iron determination underneath, promising forgiveness for those who accept new realities, while hinting at consequences awaiting continued resistance. The speech lasts barely 10 minutes, but its implications will reshape Florentine governance for decades. Money begins flowing immediately, as frozen assets thaw under the warmth of restored confidence. Credit lines reopen to merchants whose enterprises had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Construction resumes on projects that languished incomplete. The harbour bustles with activity as ships return to routes they had abandoned during the interregnum. Within weeks, the city hums with prosperity that makes citizens wonder how they ever imagined life without proper guidance. Yet this restoration comes with subtle but fundamental changes that distinguish the new regime from its predecessor. Where his father ruled through influence disguised as advice, the Patriarch governs through mechanisms that acknowledge reality while preserving republican appearances. Council positions fall to men whose loyalty trumps their lineage, while tax assessments reflect political wisdom rather than ancient custom. Opposition voices find themselves marginalized not through violence, but through irrelevance. The Palazzo Medici rises during these triumphant years, like a stone declaration of permanent authority. Brunelleschi's nephew designs spaces that balance domestic comfort with ceremonial grandeur, creating environments where family life coexists with affairs of state. Each room tells stories through artistic decoration that celebrates both civic virtue and personal achievement, while gardens provide settings for conversations that shape continental politics beneath pergolas heavy with grapevines. Within these walls, morning audiences determine not merely Florence's daily governance, but Italy's broader destiny. Ambassadors from kingdoms throughout Europe compete for attention, understanding that papal politics, imperial ambitions, and commercial networks all intersect in this unlikely court. Maps cover tables where strategy sessions plot alliances that span from Scotland to Cyprus, while correspondence arrives hourly from agents whose reports enable decisions that anticipate crises before they fully develop. San Marco Monastery becomes the jewel that demonstrates how spiritual devotion can enhance rather than contradict earthly wisdom. The scriptorium, where Dominican friars copy ancient texts, serves scholars whose research illuminates both classical philosophy and contemporary theology. Conversations between religious and secular thinkers create intellectual synthesis that influences universities throughout Europe. The library accumulates manuscripts whose value exceeds most princes' treasures, making this foundation a pilgrimage destination for anyone seeking wisdom rather than mere knowledge. Fra Angelico transforms walls into windows, opening onto divine mysteries, as his brush captures spiritual truths that transcend material representation. Each fresco tells biblical stories with emotional intensity that moves even sophisticated viewers to tears, while technical innovation demonstrates how artistic genius serves higher purposes than mere decoration. Visitors from distant lands carry descriptions of these masterpieces to courts where rulers dream of commissioning similar works from artists who learn their craft in sponsored workshops. The Platonic Academy that emerges from his patronage creates new forms of intellectual community that bridge classical wisdom and Christian revelation. Marsilio Ficino leads discussions where ancient Greek philosophy illuminates contemporary spiritual questions, while humanist scholarship enriches traditional theology. Young scholars arrive from across Europe seeking education that prepares them for careers in diplomacy, law, and church governance. Their letters home spread Florentine influence to regions where military conquest could never penetrate. Diplomatic correspondence reveals how completely the statesman has mastered the delicate art of maintaining independence, while participating in alliance systems that span continents. His agents negotiate treaties between warring princes while ensuring that Florence profits from peace rather than suffering from conflict. Intelligence networks provide early warning about military campaigns, trade disruptions, and political upheavals that might threaten Tuscan interests. Each successful mediation enhances his reputation as a leader whose wisdom transcends narrow partisan concerns. Francesco Sforza discovers in him an ally whose support proves more valuable than any military alliance when the condottiere seeks legitimacy for his conquest of Milan. Family gold funds the mercenary captain's transformation from hired sword into hereditary duke, creating gratitude that protects Florentine interests in Lombardy for generations. This investment demonstrates how financial resources can reshape political geography more effectively than armies, turning enemies into clients through calculated generosity. The Peace of Lodi emerges from negotiations where representatives play crucial roles in balancing competing ambitions that might otherwise ignite peninsula-wide warfare. The treaty establishes frameworks for resolving disputes through diplomacy rather than combat, creating stability that enables commerce to flourish while reducing military expenses that drain civic treasuries. Each signatory recognizes that this agreement serves their individual interests while advancing collective prosperity that benefits everyone. Cotton manufacturing transforms rural landscapes as investments create employment opportunities that keep citizens productive while generating profits that fund further expansion. Water-powered mills convert mountain streams into industrial assets, while improved roads connect production centers to markets throughout Europe. Technical innovations borrowed from Flemish cities increase efficiency, while maintaining quality standards that establish Florentine textiles as luxury goods commanding premium prices. The dome of Santa Maria del Fiore finally pierces the sky as Brunelleschi's engineering genius receives funding adequate to complete the most ambitious architectural project of the age. The banker walks through the completed cathedral on dedication day, listening to choirs whose voices soar toward heaven through spaces that embody mathematical harmony made manifest in stone. The achievement represents not merely architectural triumph, but demonstration of what becomes possible when vision receives resources sufficient for realization. Building projects multiply throughout the city as prosperity enables investments in infrastructure that serve both practical and symbolic purposes. New bridges span the Arno, while strengthened walls protect against enemies who never materialize, because diplomacy prevents conflicts that military preparation cannot. Public fountains provide clean water, while their sculptural decoration beautifies neighborhoods where merchants and craftsmen raise families in security their grandparents never knew. Education flourishes as humanist scholars establish curricula that prepare students for careers in the expanded world that trade and diplomacy have created. Latin instruction enables communication across linguistic boundaries, while mathematical training supports commercial activities that span continents. Historical studies provide examples of statecraft that inform contemporary decisions, while philosophical inquiry develops reasoning skills that serve both spiritual and temporal purposes. Poggio Bracciolini leads expeditions to monasteries where ancient manuscripts moulder in neglected libraries, his discoveries rescuing classical texts from oblivion while enriching modern understanding of forgotten wisdom. Each recovered work reveals new facets of Greek and Roman achievement that inspire contemporary artists, architects, and philosophers. The accumulated knowledge transforms Florence into a repository of human learning that attracts students from throughout the known world. Banking innovations continue evolving as experience reveals new possibilities for serving clients while managing risks that could threaten institutional stability. Currency exchanges enable merchants to conduct business across political boundaries without losing value to unreliable local coinages. Documentary credits eliminate the dangers of transporting precious metals through territories where bandits and wars threaten travelers. Insurance policies protect against losses that might otherwise bankrupt careful businessmen whose enterprises depend on favorable outcomes beyond their direct control. Family ties formed through marriage often cross boundaries of class and location, where romance meets strategy. His wife, Contessina de' Bardi, brings connections to one of Europe's oldest financial dynasties, her family's experience complementing innovations. Their children receive educations that prepare them for responsibilities, encompassing both domestic governance and international diplomacy. The bank's branches multiply across Europe as success creates opportunities that extend the enterprise's reach into markets previously dominated by local competitors. Agents in major cities provide services that facilitate trade, while gathering intelligence about political developments, economic trends, and cultural changes that might affect Florentine interests. Each office becomes an embassy, where commercial relationships support diplomatic initiatives while business profits fund political influence. Rival families learn to accommodate realities that make opposition futile rather than merely dangerous, as authority becomes so thoroughly established that challenging it seems pointless. The Patriae focus their ambitions on commercial success rather than political competition, while the Strozzi seek advancement through collaboration rather than confrontation. Former enemies discover that cooperation brings rewards that conflict could never provide. Private discussions in garden pavilions, where fruit trees provide shade for conversations that reshape European balance, shape alliances that prevent wars, while ensuring that Florence benefits from whatever conflicts do emerge. Visitors from distant courts seek his counsel on matters ranging from succession disputes to trade negotiations. His opinions carry weight not because of any official title, but because his judgment has proven reliable in situations where mistakes cost kingdoms. Charitable foundations, established during these prosperous years, address social needs that government resources cannot adequately meet, while demonstrating civic virtue that enhances the donor's reputation. Hospitals expand their capacity while improving medical care available to all citizens. Orphanages provide homes for children whose parents fall victim to plague or poverty. Educational institutions offer opportunities for talented students whose families lack resources for formal schooling. The study in his palazzo becomes a destination for anyone seeking wisdom about statecraft, commerce, or cultural patronage. As reputation for practical wisdom spreads throughout Europe, books line walls where natural light illuminates texts, ranging from classical philosophy to contemporary treatises on governance. Visitors find a man whose conversation reveals depths of knowledge gained through decades of experience in managing complex enterprises while navigating political challenges that would overwhelm less capable leaders. Age brings reflection on achievements that have transformed not merely the family's fortunes, but the entire concept of how intelligent leadership can shape historical developments. The empire he inherited was built on financial innovation. The legacy he prepares to bequeath encompasses cultural patronage, political wisdom, and diplomatic skill that will influence European development for centuries. Written instructions accumulate alongside account books as he prepares successors for responsibilities that extend far beyond mere wealth management. Death comes to the elder in August 1464, finding him surrounded by evidence of achievements that earned him recognition as the unofficial ruler of one of Europe's most influential cities. The funeral procession that carries his body to final rest includes representatives from kingdoms throughout the continent, their presence demonstrating international respect for a man who never held royal title, but wielded influence that many crowned heads envied. The inscription Patriae, carved on his tomb, acknowledges what citizens already understood, that he had become father to his country in ways that transcended biological relationship or legal authority. His guidance had transformed Florence from regional commercial center into continental power, while preserving republican traditions that legitimized authority through service rather than mere inheritance. The title, last bestowed on Julius Caesar, places him among history's most successful leaders. Lorenzo de' Medici inherits not merely vast wealth, but something far more valuable: institutional structures that generate influence through competence rather than coercion. The networks his grandfather established and his father perfected now serve the brilliant young man whose vision will carry family authority to heights that even the great patriarch might have thought impossible. The foundation has been laid for achievements that will define the very meaning of Renaissance magnificence. Spring sunlight filters through cypress trees as Lorenzo de' Medici walks among marble statues in his garden, 20 years old, an heir to an empire that spans continents. At his side, a 14-year-old boy named Michelangelo chips away at a block of stone, his young hands already guided by genius that will reshape the very meaning of art. The contrast between patron and protégé captures perfectly the spirit of an age when wealth serves beauty, when power nurtures talent, and when a banker's grandson can become the unofficial king of Renaissance culture. The burden of inheritance weighs heavily on shoulders that have never known defeat. His grandfather built foundations of influence through patient calculation, while his father, Piero the Gouty, maintained them through careful navigation of political storms that could have destroyed lesser men. Now the weight of expectation falls upon this brilliant young man, whose education encompassed not merely commerce and statecraft, but poetry, philosophy, and the arts that transform cities into legends. Florence in 1469 pulses with energy that makes other Italian cities seem provincial by comparison. Markets overflow with goods from 3 continents, while workshops echo with hammers shaping bronze, chisels carving marble, and brushes capturing light on canvas. The cathedral dome that his great-grandfather helped fund dominates the skyline like a crown, while new palaces rise throughout the city as prosperity enables architectural dreams that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, currents of change flow that will test every skill the young heir possesses. The banking empire his ancestors created faces challenges from competitors who have learned to copy innovations while offering better terms to clients. International politics grow increasingly complex as French ambitions clash with imperial designs and papal schemes. Most dangerously, the very success that makes Florence prosperous also breeds envy among rivals who plot constantly to bring down the family that has risen so far above their ancient stations. Lorenzo's first test comes not from enemies, but from allies who question whether youth can handle responsibilities that would challenge seasoned statesmen. Council meetings, where his grandfather once commanded automatic respect, now feature debates about policies he proposes. Older merchants whisper about the dangers of entrusting vast enterprises to someone whose beard has barely begun to darken. Loyal supporters sometimes whisper doubts, wondering if greatness missed a generation, leaving him chasing goals beyond his reach. But doubt evaporates like morning mist when he demonstrates abilities that surpass even optimistic expectations. His first diplomatic mission to Rome results in agreements that strengthen Florentine positions while maintaining independence from papal interference. Negotiations with Venetian merchants produce trade deals that increase profits while reducing risks associated with Eastern commerce. Most impressively, his management of family finances reveals understanding of complex international transactions that amazes even experienced bankers. The Platonic Academy becomes his laboratory for experiments in combining intellectual excellence with political power. Marsilio Ficino leads discussions where ancient philosophy illuminates contemporary problems, while Christian theology provides frameworks for understanding human nature and divine purpose. Scholars from across Europe arrive seeking patronage that enables research into classical texts, mathematical principles, and scientific observations that expand knowledge in directions their medieval predecessors never imagined. Within these scholarly circles, the patron develops ideas about leadership that transcend traditional concepts of authority based on birth or military conquest. He envisions rulers who govern through cultural influence rather than mere coercion, who create loyalty through inspiration rather than fear, who achieve immortality through achievements that outlast their earthly lives. These conversations prepare him for challenges that will require every resource of mind and spirit. Poetry flows from his pen with facility that astounds contemporaries accustomed to viewing political leaders as crude men whose only talents involve accumulating wealth and wielding swords. His verses explore themes of love, beauty, and human destiny with sophistication that rivals the greatest literary achievements of his age. More importantly, this artistic activity creates bonds with writers, musicians, and painters, whose work will carry Florentine influence to regions where armies could never penetrate. The palace becomes a magnet, attracting the most talented individuals of the age, as word spreads about a patron whose generosity matches his discrimination. Botticelli receives commissions that enable creation of masterpieces like Primavera and Birth of Venus, works that capture mythological themes with emotional intensity that speaks to souls across centuries. Leonardo da Vinci finds support for experiments in engineering, anatomy, and artistic technique that push human knowledge into previously unexplored territories. Musical evenings in the Great Hall feature performances that blend sacred and secular traditions, while introducing innovations that influence composers throughout Europe. The finest voices compete for opportunities to sing before audiences that include ambassadors, scholars, and artists whose approval can establish reputations that last lifetimes. These gatherings create cultural networks that spread Renaissance ideas far beyond Florence's walls. But the greatest test of leadership comes not through artistic patronage, but through violent crisis that threatens to destroy everything his family has built. The Patriae conspiracy erupts on April 26, 1478, during High Mass at the cathedral, when assassins strike at the moment of greatest sacred solemnity. Knives flash in holy light as Francesco Pazzi and his accomplices attempt to murder both brothers during the elevation of the host. Giuliano falls immediately, his blood pooling on marble floors where thousands have knelt in prayer. But Lorenzo survives the attack through combination of quick reflexes and loyal friends who shield him from further assault. Wounded but alive, he reaches the safety of the sacristy while chaos erupts throughout the cathedral. The conspirators had expected the city to rise against family rule. Instead, crowds surge through streets shouting, "Patriae! Patriae!" the battle cry that proclaims continued loyalty to the red spheres on their coat of arms. Swift justice follows as the full extent of the plot becomes clear. Francesco Salviati, Archbishop of Pisa and key conspirator, swings from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria alongside other traitors' bodies, become warnings to anyone contemplating similar treachery. Revenge, however, isn't limited to execution. Through the Magnificent, it becomes a warning that harming his own puts the whole Republic at risk. Pope Sixtus IV, whose nephew's ambitions helped fuel the conspiracy, discovers that supporting failed assassinations carries consequences that extend far beyond diplomatic embarrassment. The war that follows pits papal armies against Florentine forces while testing alliances that span the Italian peninsula. Yet even military conflict provides opportunities for Lorenzo to demonstrate qualities that transform political calculation into personal magnetism. His journey to Naples in 1479 represents either supreme confidence or desperate gamble, as he places himself in the hands of King Ferdinand, whose support for the papal cause makes him technically an enemy. The negotiations that follow reveal diplomatic skills that match those of any professional ambassador, while demonstrating courage that wins respect from men accustomed to judging leaders by their willingness to risk everything for their people's welfare. The peace that emerges from these discussions establishes new patterns of Italian politics based on balance rather than domination. The patron's reputation as a mediator who can find solutions satisfying all parties while protecting Florentine interests makes him the unofficial arbiter of peninsular disputes. His advice carries weight in courts from Milan to Naples, because his judgment has proven reliable in situations where mistakes could cost kingdoms. Cultural achievements multiply as prosperity enables patronage on scales that dwarf previous efforts. The Laurentian Library accumulates manuscripts that preserve classical learning while supporting contemporary scholarship. Workshops supported by family funds produce innovations in painting, sculpture, and architecture that influence artistic development throughout Europe. Most importantly, the integration of humanist learning with Christian faith creates intellectual synthesis that enriches both traditions. Marriage to Clarice Orsini brings political advantages that strengthen alliances with Roman nobility, while providing personal happiness that enriches his poetry with themes of domestic contentment. Their children receive educations that prepare them for responsibilities, encompassing both spiritual and temporal leadership. The family grows in influence as well as numbers, with relatives holding positions throughout Europe that extend Florentine reach into regions previously beyond their influence. The villa at Careggi becomes a retreat where philosophers, artists, and statesmen gather for conversations that shape Renaissance thought. Garden walks provide settings for discussions that blend practical politics with theoretical speculation about ideal forms of government. These intellectual experiments influence political developments throughout Italy, as participants carry new ideas back to their home cities. Banking operations continue expanding, despite increased competition from rivals who have learned to copy successful innovations. New branches open in major commercial centers, while existing offices develop services that anticipate client needs. The network of correspondence provides intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and cultural trends that enable decisions that consistently prove profitable. Though their influence now eclipses that of any who came before, the signs of looming struggles are starting to pile up. The bank's resources, while still enormous, strain under the costs of maintaining cultural patronage, political influence, and military preparation simultaneously. Competitors offer terms that sometimes exceed what prudent banking practices can match. Most ominously, the lavish spending that makes Florence the cultural capital of Europe gradually depletes reserves that earlier generations accumulated through more cautious policies. International politics grow increasingly complex as French ambitions to control Italian territories clash with imperial designs and papal schemes. The delicate balance that has preserved Florentine independence requires constant attention to shifting alliances that could collapse without warning. Each diplomatic success creates new obligations, while generating fresh enemies who plot constantly to upset arrangements that favor the Republic's interests. Religious tensions simmer beneath the surface as reformist preachers like Girolamo Savonarola begin attacking the secular humanism that has become closely identified with family leadership. The Dominican friars' sermons draw crowds who respond enthusiastically to calls for spiritual purification that implicitly challenge the worldly magnificence that defines Lorenzo's reign. These religious stirrings suggest future conflicts between sacred and secular authority. Cultural patronage reaches its zenith as the final years of his life witness creation of masterpieces that will define Renaissance achievement for centuries. Michelangelo's early works demonstrate genius that justifies every florin invested in his development. Scholarly projects supported by family funds produce editions of classical texts that influence European intellectual development. The accumulated artistic treasures transform Florence into a pilgrimage destination for anyone seeking beauty that transcends mere material success. The pressures of ruling take their toll, wearing down a body already weakened by the gout passed through generations. Yet even physical suffering cannot diminish the intellectual energy that continues producing poetry, supporting scholarship, and managing political relationships that require constant attention. His bedroom becomes an office where the business of governing continues, despite pain that would disable lesser men. The villa of Poggio a Caiano rises during these final years as a monument to architectural innovation that blends classical proportions with contemporary comfort. The building serves as both family retreat and showcase for artistic excellence that demonstrates how wealth can serve beauty while providing practical benefits. Visitors from across Europe carry away impressions of magnificence that enhances Florentine prestige throughout the known world. Educational innovations influence universities throughout Europe, as humanist curricula developed under his patronage prove superior to traditional methods focused solely on theological training. Students educated in Florentine schools carry new approaches to learning that emphasize critical thinking, historical analysis, and literary excellence. These intellectual exports extend cultural influence into regions where commercial networks cannot penetrate. The approach of death in early 1492 finds Lorenzo surrounded by evidence of achievements that have transformed his family's financial empire into something approaching cultural dominion over European civilization. Letters arrive daily from rulers seeking his counsel on matters ranging from succession disputes to artistic commissions. His opinions influence decisions made in courts he has never visited by princes who recognize superior wisdom when they encounter it. Piero the Unfortunate waits in the wings to inherit vast wealth and international influence that his father's genius has accumulated. Yet the young man's education, while thorough, has not prepared him for challenges that will require every resource of mind and spirit his predecessor possessed. The delicate balance between prosperity and expenditure, between independence and alliance, between secular magnificence and spiritual authority will test abilities that remain largely untested. Final conversations in the villa at Careggi reveal a man who understands that his greatest achievements transcend mere political success or financial accumulation. The artists he has supported will create works that inspire future generations, long after political arrangements dissolve into historical memory. The scholars whose research he funded will advance human knowledge in directions that benefit all mankind. The synthesis of classical wisdom and Christian faith that has flourished under his patronage will influence European intellectual development for centuries. Death comes on April 8th, 1492, as spring returns to Tuscany and the Renaissance approaches its most dangerous crisis. The funeral procession that carries his body through streets lined with citizens who mourn not merely a ruler, but the end of an age, demonstrates how completely he had captured the imagination of his people. Representatives from across Europe attend ceremonies that mark not just personal loss, but historical transition from one era to another. The inscription that will eventually mark his tomb calls him Lorenzo the Magnificent, a title that acknowledges achievements in cultural patronage that exceed those of most crowned heads. His legacy lies not in territories conquered or enemies defeated, but in beauty created, knowledge advanced, and human potential realized through intelligent application of wealth to purposes that serve eternal rather than merely temporal goals. Florence stands transformed as news of his death spreads throughout Europe. The city that his great-great-grandfather found as one commercial center among many has become the acknowledged capital of Renaissance civilization. Yet the very magnificence that defines his achievement also contains seeds of future crisis, for the resources required to maintain such splendor exceed what even the most successful banking can sustain indefinitely. The stage is set for trials that will test whether his heir possesses abilities equal to the challenges that await. Thunder rolls across the Tuscan hills as Piero the Unfortunate stares at maps spread across his father's desk, their borders suddenly meaningless in the face of French armies, marching through Alpine passes like a divine scourge sent to punish Italian pride. Charles VIII of France advances with 40,000 men and ambitions that encompass not merely Naples, but the reshaping of the entire peninsula according to Gallic designs. The 20-year-old heir to Renaissance magnificence faces his first great crisis, armed with inherited wealth, but lacking the genius that made such challenges seem manageable in his father's hands. The contrast between son and father becomes painfully evident as ambassadors arrive seeking guidance about responses to French demands. Where Lorenzo would have found diplomatic solutions that protected Florentine independence while avoiding military catastrophe, his successor wavers between defiance that could invite destruction and submission that would sacrifice everything his ancestors built. Council meetings echo with debates that reveal how completely the Republic had depended on one man's extraordinary abilities. Giovanni de' Medici, barely 17, but already displaying the political instincts that will serve him well in future papal career, watches his brother's struggles with growing alarm. Cardinal though he may become, he understands that spiritual authority means nothing without temporal foundations to support it. The dynasty stands at a crossroads where wrong choices could undo generations of careful construction in a matter of months. French negotiators arrive in Florence like wolves entering a sheepfold, their demands escalating with each meeting as they sense weakness in their opponents. They require not merely safe passage through Tuscan territory, but active support for campaigns against Naples, provisions for armies that consume resources like locusts, and strategic fortresses that would make Florence a client state rather than an independent republic. The terms grow more onerous as talks continue, revealing how thoroughly external perceptions of strength had depended on Lorenzo's personal reputation. The fatal decision comes in November 1494, when Piero agrees to surrender key fortresses without consulting either council or citizens who will bear the consequences of his capitulation. Sarzana, Pietrasanta, and other strongholds that guard Florentine approaches pass into French hands like dice thrown carelessly across a gaming table. News of this betrayal spreads through the city with shocking speed, transforming popular anxiety into rage that threatens to consume everything in its path. 2 years after mourning Lorenzo, many now scorn his son's timidity, recognizing how deeply their peace had depended on a leader no longer there. Merchants whose prosperity flowed from trade networks built over generations watch their carefully constructed relationships crumble under pressure that competent diplomacy could have managed. Even family supporters begin to question whether loyalty serves any purpose when it means supporting policies that threaten everyone's survival. The Signoria convenes an emergency session as crowds gather in the streets demanding explanations for decisions that seem to sacrifice Florentine independence for temporary safety. Voices that once praised the dynasty's wisdom now denounce its degeneracy, while speakers who had remained silent during successful years suddenly discover courage to challenge authority that appears vulnerable. The transformation from hero worship to hostile criticism occurs with stunning rapidity. Girolamo Savonarola seizes this moment of crisis, like a prophet recognizing divine appointment to leadership. The Dominican friar had spent years preaching in relative obscurity, while Lorenzo's secular magnificence commanded popular attention. But French invasion creates opportunities for different kinds of guidance. His sermons at San Marco draw enormous crowds eager to hear explanations for catastrophes that make traditional politics seem inadequate. The prior's message resonates powerfully with citizens who had begun to question whether their city's prosperity came at too high a spiritual cost. Years of humanist celebration of pagan philosophy, artistic glorification of mythological themes, and political alliance with corrupt papal courts had created undercurrents of religious anxiety that surfaced during moments of crisis. Savonarola articulates these concerns with prophetic authority that makes his listeners feel they participate in divine drama rather than merely human history. November, riots erupt as news arrives that Piero has opened additional fortresses to French occupation. Citizens storm through streets toward the palace, where crowds demand explanations from leaders who seem to have forgotten their primary obligation to protect those they govern. The younger son attempts to address the mob from palace windows, but his words carry no weight, with people who measure leadership through results rather than rhetoric. Flight becomes inevitable as the Signoria votes to exile the entire lineage in recognition that their continued presence threatens public order. Piero, Giovanni, and Giuliano de' Medici gather what portable wealth they can carry before escaping through rear gates while crowds loot their palace with fury that transforms grief into destructive celebration. Servants who had served the household for generations watch helplessly as treasures accumulated over decades disappear into eager hands. The sacking of the palace reveals how thoroughly popular opinion had shifted from veneration to vilification. Manuscripts that Lorenzo collected with passionate care burn in street fires, while citizens argue about whether preserving pagan literature serves any legitimate purpose. Sculptures that demonstrated Florentine artistic excellence suffer damage from hammers wielded by people who see them as symbols of corrupted values rather than cultural achievement. Savonarola emerges from this chaos as the unlikely leader of a republic, transformed from secular oligarchy into religious democracy. His vision of Florence as the New Jerusalem captures imaginations that secular politics had failed to inspire, offering spiritual purpose that transcends mere material prosperity. People who had grown disillusioned with beauty-driven celebrations are newly inspired by changes aimed at higher, divine purposes. The bonfire of the vanities becomes the defining ceremony of this transformed city, as citizens voluntarily surrender possessions they now view as obstacles to salvation. Cosmetics, jewelry, books, paintings, and musical instruments fuel flames that rise toward heaven like prayers made manifest in smoke. Even some artists contribute their own works to the conflagration, choosing spiritual purification over aesthetic achievement. Republican government, under Savonarola's guidance, attempts to create political institutions that embody Christian principles rather than classical precedents. Council membership expands to include broader segments of society, while decision-making processes emphasize moral considerations alongside practical concerns. The experiment attracts attention from across Europe, as observers wonder whether religious reform can provide foundations for effective governance. But theocracy proves no more stable than oligarchy had been when confronted with external pressures that require pragmatic responses. Papal excommunication isolates Florence diplomatically, while French withdrawal leaves the city vulnerable to enemies who had been restrained only by fear of Gallic retaliation. Economic disruption resulting from moral reforms creates hardships that test popular commitment to spiritual objectives. Opposition to Savonarola's rule grows as practical difficulties multiply beyond what religious enthusiasm can overcome. Merchants who depend on international trade suffer from diplomatic isolation, while craftsmen find markets for luxury goods evaporating under moral pressure. Even committed reformers begin questioning whether their leaders' visions serve earthly welfare or merely personal ambition disguised as prophetic calling. The trial by fire that Franciscan and Dominican representatives agree to undergo becomes the catalyst that destroys Savonarola's authority as surely as secular failures had doomed his predecessors. When the ordeal fails to occur due to disputes over procedural details, popular faith in divine support for reform collapses with stunning suddenness. Once swept up in the friar's cause, his former supporters now denounce him with the same fiery passion. Arrest comes swiftly once those who had once hesitated to confront the prophet find boldness in the absence of public backing. The prior's execution in May 1498 occurs on the same spot where vanities had burned, demonstrating how completely Florence had rejected both secular magnificence and religious extremism in favor of something approaching moderate republicanism. Niccolò Machiavelli assumes his position as second chancellor during these turbulent years, observing political transformations that will influence his later theoretical works. His correspondence reveals acute understanding of how quickly popular enthusiasm can shift from one extreme to another, while noting that effective governance requires stability that emotional movements cannot provide. These experiences shape ideas about principled leadership that will appear in treatises destined to influence political thought for centuries. The restored republic struggles with challenges that had defeated both Piero's inherited authority and Savonarola's charismatic leadership. External threats from papal armies and imperial forces require military responses that strain civic finances, while internal divisions prevent unified action needed for effective resistance. Citizens begin to wonder whether independence serves any purpose if it means constant warfare and economic decline. Gonfaloniere Piero Soderini attempts to provide steady leadership that avoids extremes of either secular excess or religious fanaticism. His policies emphasize practical governance that serves citizen welfare without pursuing grandiose objectives that exceed available resources. Yet moderation proves difficult to maintain when neighboring powers view Florentine weakness as an invitation for territorial expansion. The League of Cambrai reshapes Italian politics as European powers combine against Venetian expansion while pursuing their own territorial objectives. Florence finds itself isolated between competing alliances that offer no satisfactory options for maintaining independence. Each diplomatic choice creates new enemies, while failing to provide reliable protection against existing threats. As the Republic fights to reclaim lands lost in earlier turmoil, its military campaigns steadily exhaust public resources. The siege of Pisa becomes a prolonged agony that consumes money, manpower, and morale while achieving limited success. Citizens begin questioning whether republican government can provide security that earlier regimes had guaranteed through different methods. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici observes these developments from Roman exile, while building alliances that will eventually enable his return to Florence. His ecclesiastical career advances rapidly as papal courts recognize talents that secular politics had failed to utilize effectively. The contrast between his rising influence and his homeland's declining fortunes suggests possibilities for future restoration. Spanish intervention in Italian affairs creates new opportunities for exiled families willing to support foreign objectives that serve their private interests. The cardinal's negotiations with imperial representatives demonstrate how completely the political landscape has changed since his father's death. International alliances now matter more than popular support in determining who exercises authority over Italian cities. The Holy League forms to expel French forces from Italy while restoring traditional rulers to territories that republican experiments had failed to govern effectively. Florence's position becomes increasingly precarious as allies abandon republican principles in favor of monarchical stability. The experiment in popular government appears destined to end in foreign occupation rather than domestic evolution. Battle of Ravenna in 1512 eliminates French protection that had enabled republican survival, while Spanish victory creates conditions favorable to aristocratic restoration. News of the defeat spreads panic through Florence, as citizens realize their isolation exposes them to enemies who had been restrained only by fear of Gallic retaliation. Preparation for siege begins as the reality of military weakness becomes undeniably apparent. Medici restoration occurs through Spanish arms, rather than popular invitation, as imperial forces approach Florence with demands that republican government surrender authority to representatives of the exiled dynasty. The choice between resistance that means destruction and submission that preserves some autonomy creates divisions that prevent unified response to external pressure. Ramon de Cardona leads Spanish troops toward Florence, while Cardinal Giovanni follows at a careful distance, preparing to resume authority that his family had lost through his brother's incompetence. The combination of foreign military support and internal exhaustion with republican experiments creates conditions that make restoration seem inevitable rather than merely possible. Those who once rejoiced at the fall of tyranny now brace for its return, seeing it as the lesser evil next to foreign control. The transformation from republican enthusiasm to monarchical acceptance demonstrates how quickly political principles yield to practical necessity when survival hangs in the balance. September 1512 witnesses the end of an experiment that had promised to create new forms of governance, but had succeeded mainly in proving the difficulty of maintaining independence without competent leadership. The cardinal enters Florence not as a returning exile, but as a conqueror supported by foreign arms and domestic exhaustion. His brother Giuliano accompanies him, while citizens who had once demanded their heads now cheer their restoration. The wheel of fortune completes another revolution as the dynasty that had seemed permanently discredited reclaims authority through circumstances that demonstrate the instability of all human institutions. Palaces that had stood empty for nearly 2 decades prepare to house rulers whose experience of exile has taught lessons about the relationship between power and popularity that their predecessors never learned. The restoration will proceed according to principles that emphasize security over magnificence, stability over innovation, and foreign alliance over domestic support. Florence prepares to enter a new phase of its history, under leaders who understand that authority depends more on external backing than internal consent. Smoke rises white above the Sistine Chapel as cardinals emerge from their sacred deliberations, proclaiming to the world that Giovanni de' Medici has ascended to the throne of St. Peter. The son who fled Florence in disgrace returns as Pope Leo X, commanding spiritual dominion over Christendom, while wielding temporal influence that surpasses anything his ancestors achieved through commerce alone. At 37, he embodies the convergence of Renaissance humanism and papal ambition, ready to transform Rome into a stage worthy of divine drama played out through human magnificence. The coronation procession winds through streets lined with tapestries and adorned with triumphal arches, as Romans celebrate their new pontiff with enthusiasm born of practical calculation. Leo brings with him Florentine wealth, artistic patronage, and political connections that promise to restore papal prestige, damaged by decades of warfare and scandal. Cardinals who elected him understand that spiritual leadership requires material resources sufficient to command respect from kings who measure influence through golden display rather than theological argument. Within months of his election, the Vatican transforms into a cultural center that rivals the courts of France and Spain. Raphael receives commissions that enable completion of masterpieces whose beauty transcends sectarian boundaries, while architects plan projects that will reshape the eternal city according to Renaissance principles. The papal apartments echo with conversations conducted in Latin, Greek, Italian, and French as scholars, diplomats, and artists compete for access to a patron whose generosity exceeds even legendary accounts of family magnificence. But splendor requires funding that strains even the vast resources of the church, forcing the new pontiff to explore financial innovations that will ultimately trigger religious revolution. The sale of indulgences accelerates under his reign, as German territories provide eager markets for spiritual benefits that promise salvation in exchange for contributions to papal projects. Each transaction generates revenues that enable continued artistic patronage, while creating theological controversies that threaten to tear Christendom apart. Martin Luther's hammer strikes the door of Wittenberg's castle church, with sounds that echo across Europe like thunder, announcing the approaching storm. The Augustinian monk's 95 Theses challenge not merely specific abuses, but fundamental assumptions about papal supremacy, priestly mediation, and the relationship between faith and works. Reports of these developments reach Rome through diplomatic channels, but their implications receive less attention than preparations for carnival celebrations that demonstrate papal magnificence to visiting dignitaries. Leo initially dismisses German protests as theological squabbling between monks whose disputes matter less than Italian politics or artistic commissions. His education in humanist classics has prepared him for debates about classical philosophy and literary interpretation, but not for challenges to ecclesiastical governance that question the very foundations of papal control. The sophistication that serves him well in cultural patronage becomes liability when confronting religious enthusiasm that values scriptural teaching above traditional precedent. Meanwhile, in Florence, the restored dynasty governs through methods that blend traditional oligarchy with innovations designed to prevent future republican uprisings. Giuliano de' Medici serves as nominal head of state, while Cardinal Giovanni's representatives implement policies that prioritize stability over popular consent. Citizens who had experimented with democratic governance discover that their new rulers prefer security to liberty, order to innovation. The death of Giuliano in 1516 creates succession questions that reveal how thoroughly the lineage has adapted to changed circumstances. Rather than risking popular elections that might restore republican institutions, papal influence ensures that Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici assumes leadership despite his youth and inexperience. The appointment demonstrates how completely spiritual and temporal powers have merged under Leo's guidance. Young Lorenzo's marriage to Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne represents diplomatic triumph that connects the bloodline to French royal circles while providing opportunities for territorial expansion beyond traditional Florentine boundaries. The wedding festivities celebrate not merely personal union, but political alliance that could reshape the balance of Italian influences. Yet these international connections create obligations that may exceed the family's ability to honor commitments that span multiple kingdoms. Ecclesiastical politics become increasingly complex as the pontiff navigates between French ambitions, Spanish claims, and Habsburg designs that threaten to partition Italy among foreign powers. The delicate balance his ancestors maintained through commercial neutrality proves impossible when papal office requires taking sides in conflicts that affect the spiritual welfare of entire populations. Each alliance creates enemies, while failing to provide security that transcends temporary military advantages. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica becomes the monument that embodies both Leo's cultural vision and his financial difficulties. Bramante's architectural plans require resources that exceed anything previously attempted, while artistic decorations demand skills that only the greatest masters possess. The project demonstrates papal grandeur while creating costs that strain church revenues beyond their capacity to bear such magnificent burdens. Though he redefines how the papacy dispenses its favor, he's met with reformers whose critiques strike at the heart of the church's command, not just its excesses. Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor creates a temporal rival whose might transcends national boundaries, while French opposition to Habsburg ambitions threatens to engulf Italy in warfare that could destroy everything Renaissance culture has achieved. Lutheran ideas spread through German territories with speed that astonishes observers accustomed to slower patterns of intellectual change. Printing presses multiply heretical texts faster than church officials can suppress them, while popular enthusiasm for reform creates movements that surpass their leaders' ability to control them. What began as academic debate evolves into religious revolution that threatens to shatter the unity of Western Christianity. The Diet of Worms becomes the stage where Habsburg and papal representatives attempt to contain Lutheran enthusiasm through combinations of theological argument and political pressure. Yet Luther's refusal to recant his positions demonstrates that religious conviction can transcend considerations of personal safety or institutional loyalty. The monk's stand inspires similar resistance throughout Europe, as reformers discover courage to challenge establishments they once feared to oppose. In Florence, Lorenzo di Piero's brief leadership ends with his death in 1519, creating another succession crisis that reveals the dynasty's dependence on papal support rather than popular consent. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici assumes responsibility for Florentine governance while pursuing his own ecclesiastical ambitions that will eventually elevate him to papal throne. The arrangement demonstrates how thoroughly church and state have merged under family direction. Leo's death in December 1521 occurs as Europe convulses with religious warfare that his policies helped trigger but could not resolve. The pontiff who transformed Rome into Renaissance showcase leaves behind artistic masterpieces that will inspire future generations, while bequeathing theological controversies that threaten to destroy the institution he served. His funeral attracts representatives from courts throughout Christendom who mourn the passing of an age when papal influence commanded universal respect. Cardinal Giulio's election as Pope Clement VII in 1523 occurs amid circumstances that would challenge even the most skilled statesman. Religious rebellion spreads through northern Europe, while Italian wars rage between French and Habsburg armies that view the peninsula as prize to be divided among conquering powers. The new pontiff inherits problems that his predecessors' policies created, but lacked wisdom or resources to solve. The sack of Rome in 1527 represents the nada of papal fortunes as Charles V's troops rampage through the Eternal City with brutality that shocks even hardened veterans of Italian warfare. Clement seeks refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo, while soldiers loot churches, destroy artworks, and massacre citizens whose only crime involved living in a city that had opposed Habsburg ambitions. The Pope, who claimed temporal dominion over Christendom, cowers behind fortress walls while his capital burns. Florence seizes this moment of papal weakness to expel family representatives once again, demonstrating that Republican sentiment had survived decades of oligarchical government. Citizens who had accepted dynastic governance, while it provided security, abandon loyalty when external pressure reveals the hollowness of claims to indispensable leadership. The revolution occurs with stunning speed as popular enthusiasm overwhelms institutional resistance. Niccolò Capone leads the restored republic with moderation that avoids extremes of both secular excess and religious fanaticism. His policies emphasize practical governance that serves citizen welfare while maintaining independence from foreign powers whose intervention had repeatedly disrupted Florentine autonomy. Yet moderation proves difficult to sustain when neighboring states view republican experiments as threats to monarchical stability. From 1529 to 1530, the siege of Florence turns into a legendary stand for republican freedom, as Habsburg and papal armies unite to bring down Italy's last independent city-state. Citizens endure months of starvation and bombardment while defending walls that protect more than territory. They guard the principle that popular consent should determine who exercises command over free peoples. Michelangelo fortifies the city's defenses with engineering skill that matches his artistic genius, demonstrating how Renaissance humanism could serve military as well as cultural purposes. His bastions and earthworks enable outnumbered defenders to resist professional armies, whose equipment and training should have guaranteed swift victory. The sculptor who carved David creates bulwarks that protect the republic David symbolized. But heroism cannot overcome mathematics when enemy resources exceed defensive capabilities by margins that make ultimate victory impossible. Food supplies dwindle while ammunition runs low, forcing leaders to choose between continued resistance that means death for all citizens, or surrender that preserves lives while sacrificing liberty. The decision to capitulate in August 1530 ends the last experiment in Italian republicanism for centuries. Charles V's restoration of family governance occurs through Habsburg decree, rather than popular invitation, as Alessandro de' Medici returns to claim leadership that foreign arms alone make possible. The emperor's recognition of him as Duke of Florence eliminates republican institutions while establishing monarchical government that depends on external support rather than domestic consent. The transformation from city-state to duchy represents fundamental change in the nature of Florentine administration. His reign quickly sours as memories of lost liberty stir discontent among the people, and resentment simmers among aristocrats offended by his birth. Opposition grows as the Duke's policies favor Spanish interests over Florentine welfare. while his personal conduct scandals those who expect ducal dignity from their rulers. Even family supporters begin questioning whether his leadership serves their interests or merely Habsburg designs for Italian domination. The Duke's marriage to Margaret of Austria, Charles V's daughter, strengthens Habsburg connections while demonstrating how thoroughly the dynasty has abandoned traditional independence for foreign protection. The wedding celebrations display magnificence that rivals royal courts, while emphasizing Florence's transformation from merchant republic into princely state. Citizens observe these festivities with emotions ranging from admiration to resentment. Artistic patronage continues under ducal government as Alessandro commissions works that demonstrate both cultural sophistication and political might. Giorgio Vasari receives support for projects that celebrate family achievements, while creating employment for artists whose skills might otherwise serve rival patrons. The policy maintains Florence's reputation as cultural center, while ensuring that artistic genius serves political purposes. But growing opposition to his reign culminates in conspiracy that demonstrates how thoroughly Republican sentiment had survived monarchical restoration. Lorenzino de' Medici, Alessandro's own cousin, leads assassination plot that views tyrannicide as patriotic duty, requiring personal sacrifice for public benefit. The planning involves risks that could cost conspirators their lives while promising liberation that might restore popular government. January 1537 brings the violent climax as Lorenzino strikes down Alessandro in the ducal palace, ending 6 years of leadership that had satisfied neither Habsburg masters nor Florentine subjects. The assassination triggers succession crisis that threatens to plunge the city into civil war, while inviting foreign intervention from powers eager to exploit internal divisions. Republican enthusiasts prepare for restoration, while Spanish supporters rally around alternative candidates. But hopes for a Republican comeback fade fast, with Habsburg troops keeping control and foreign powers handpicking Cosimo I de' Medici to follow Alessandro. The choice of this distant relative demonstrates that hereditary monarchy has replaced both republican democracy and oligarchical governance as the organizing principle of Florentine administration. Citizens who had dreamed of restored liberty discover that Habsburg interests transcend local preferences. The young duke's acceptance speech before the assembled nobility reveals political maturity that belies his 17 years, while demonstrating understanding of realities that Republican dreamers refuse to acknowledge. His words promise competent administration that serves Florentine interests within constraints imposed by Spanish supremacy. The age of city-state independence has ended. The era of territorial monarchy begins. Cosimo's early policies emphasize consolidation rather than innovation, as he works to establish leadership that depends more on demonstrated competence than inherited legitimacy. Military reforms create professional forces capable of defending the duchy, while supporting Habsburg campaigns that serve broader strategic objectives. Administrative changes improve efficiency, while ensuring that ducal commands reach every corner of Tuscan territory. The transformation from banking house to ducal dynasty represents fundamental change in both the family's identity and Florence's political structure. Where earlier generations had governed through influence that respected republican forms, these successors exercise power through mechanisms that acknowledge monarchical realities. The evolution reflects broader changes in European politics that favor centralized monarchy over distributed control. As 1537 ends, Florence prepares to enter a new phase of its history under leadership that understands how completely the world has changed since Lorenzo's death 45 years earlier. Religious warfare divides Christendom, while Habsburg ambitions reshape political geography according to dynastic rather than municipal principles. The city that had pioneered republican governance now serves as duchy within an empire that spans continents. With tension thick in the Tuscan air, 17-year-old Cosimo, the first de Medici, addresses the nobles gathered in the Palazzo della Signoria, his steady voice cutting through their whispered skepticism and commanding the room. The bastard Alessandro lies dead by his cousin's hand, while republican dreamers sharpen their knives for one final attempt at liberty. Yet this distant branch of the great tree speaks with confidence that transforms uncertainty into inevitability, promising not restoration, but revolution, the birth of absolute monarchy from the ashes of merchant republics. The selection of this young man as Duke represents calculated gamble by Spanish advisors, who recognize that weak leadership invites chaos, while strong personalities might challenge foreign interests. Cosimo's bloodline connects him to the great Cosimo through a complicated genealogy that satisfies legal requirements, while his youth suggests malleability that experienced diplomats believe they can shape to serve their purposes. They will discover too late that underestimating this particular teenager proves fatal to anyone who attempts it. Within weeks of his accession, the new ruler demonstrates political instincts that would impress Machiavelli himself. Potential rivals find themselves offered lucrative positions that remove them from Florence, while appearing to honor their talents. Republican sympathizers discover that their past activities have been catalogued with precision that suggests intelligence networks they never suspected existed. Most tellingly, Spanish advisors who expected to guide policy find themselves implementing decisions they never helped formulate. Eleonora of Toledo brings more than beauty to her marriage with the young Duke in 1539. Her father's position as Viceroy of Naples provides connections that transform Florence from Spanish client into Habsburg partner. The wedding festivities display magnificence that announces a new age of ducal splendor, while the bride's dowry funds military reforms that will make Tuscany the most efficiently governed state in Italy. Love grows alongside political advantage, as the couple discovers personal happiness within arrangements designed for dynastic benefit. Change comes quickly, with trained armies stepping in where the old militias, discredited by their failure in the siege, had once stood. Veterans recruited from across Europe train Tuscan soldiers in techniques that emphasize discipline over individual heroism, coordination over traditional bravery. Artillery parks emerge where master gunners perfect weapons that can reduce any fortress to rubble. Most importantly, command structures develop that ensure absolute obedience to ducal commands regardless of circumstances. The fortification of Florence proceeds according to plans that anticipate siege warfare, while demonstrating architectural innovation. New bastions, designed by the finest engineers, create defensive positions that could withstand bombardment by the heaviest artillery available to potential enemies. Yet these works serve psychological as well as military purposes. Citizens understand that walls strong enough to keep enemies out also prevent inhabitants from leaving when their loyalty becomes questionable. Centuries of guild rule are dismantled as sweeping reforms introduce a streamlined bureaucracy, loyal only to the Duke's hand-picked officials. Tax collection becomes regularized as officials trained in accounting methods ensure that revenues flow predictably into central treasuries. Justice transforms from local custom into centralized law as ducal courts assume jurisdiction over matters previously handled by neighborhood authorities. The Uffizi rises during these transformative years as both administrative center and architectural statement about the nature of modern governance. Giorgio Vasari designed spaces that house all governmental functions under a single roof, while creating environments that demonstrate ducal magnificence to anyone conducting business with the state. The building becomes a machine for exercising authority efficiently, while impressing visitors with the resources and sophistication of those who wield it. The old emphasis on commerce gives way to a new focus on territorial control, driven more by strategy than by financial gain. Agricultural improvements increase rural productivity, while industrial development creates employment opportunities that reduce urban discontent. Trade continues, but serves state interests rather than driving them, as the Duchy prioritizes self-sufficiency over international profits that might create dependence on foreign markets. The ducal family secures its place in Europe's royal web through marriages that outlast and outweigh any commercial ties. Daughters become duchesses and queens, while sons marry into houses that command armies and territories. Each union strengthens Tuscan security, while advancing family members into positions where their influence extends far beyond Italian boundaries. The dynasty evolves from merchant princes into genuine nobility, whose bloodlines will flow through European royal houses for centuries. Expansion begins with the conquest of Siena, that ancient rival whose independent spirit had long challenged Florentine hegemony in central Italy. The war that unfolds from 1554 to 1559 demonstrates how completely Cosimo has mastered the arts of modern statecraft. Diplomatic isolation precedes military assault, as Spanish support ensures that Sienese resistance receives no outside assistance. Professional armies, equipped with the latest weapons, systematically reduce defensive positions that had withstood medieval sieges for centuries. The Siege of Siena becomes an epic of republican heroism that ultimately proves futile against superior resources and modern warfare. Citizens endure starvation and bombardment with courage that honors their ancestors, while demonstrating the impossibility of maintaining independence without external support. The final surrender in 1559 eliminates the last serious rival to Tuscan dominance, while providing territories that double the duchy's size and population. Integration of conquered territories proceeds according to principles that blend mercy with firmness. Sienese nobles who accept ducal sovereignty retain their properties, while those who resist face exile and confiscation. Local customs continue where they don't conflict with central authority, while new laws address situations that traditional frameworks cannot handle. The policy creates loyalty through self-interest, while eliminating opposition through consequences that make resistance seem pointless. Supporting the arts keeps the family legacy alive, but also advances political aims far beyond simple admiration for beauty. The Pitti Palace expands into a residence worthy of absolute monarchy, as artists create decorative schemes that celebrate ducal achievements while providing employment for talents that might otherwise serve rival patrons. Vasari's frescoes transform ceilings and walls into historical narratives that legitimize present authority through artistic celebration of past glories. The Duke's patronage fuels a golden age of inquiry, as scholars probe nature without the constraints imposed in other lands. The Accademia del Cimento becomes Europe's first experimental society, conducting research that advances human knowledge while demonstrating Tuscan intellectual sophistication. Galileo's early career benefits from patronage that enables investigations into mathematical and astronomical questions that will revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. While staying true to Catholic orthodoxy, the Duke's approach carves out space from papal control, signaling a firm grip on local religious affairs. churches receive support for construction projects and charitable activities, while clergy understand that spiritual authority operates within boundaries established by temporal power. The Inquisition functions but cannot act without ducal permission, ensuring that religious zealotry serves state interests rather than challenging them. A unified legal code takes shape, sweeping away the jumble of regional customs in favor of standardized rules for the entire territory. The new codes balance traditional Italian law with practical innovations that address contemporary needs, while ensuring that ducal authority penetrates every aspect of social and economic life. Justice becomes predictable, as citizens understand exactly what behaviors will provoke state intervention. Tuscany gains international standing as European powers come to see it not as a city-state, but as a rising territorial force worthy of diplomacy. Marriage negotiations involve the Duchy as an equal partner, while military alliances recognize Tuscan forces as valuable assets rather than merely auxiliary troops. The transformation from commercial republic to military monarchy achieves completion when other rulers treat Cosimo as legitimate sovereign rather than successful rebel. The elevation to Grand Duke in 1569 represents papal recognition of achievements that place the dynasty among Europe's premier ruling houses. Pope Pius V's coronation ceremony acknowledges not merely territorial expansion, but governmental competence that enables effective administration of complex territories. The title creates precedence that establishes Tuscan superiority over other Italian rulers, while providing international status that commands respect throughout Europe. Yet success contains seeds of future problems, as absolute monarchy requires constant vigilance to maintain efficiency, while preventing the corruption that destroys bureaucratic systems. The Duke's health deteriorates under burdens that would challenge younger men, while succession questions create anxiety about whether his heir possesses abilities necessary for continued effective leadership. Most ominously, the financial costs of maintaining professional armies and elaborate courts strain resources despite careful fiscal management. Francesco I inherits vast territories and efficient institutions in 1574, but lacks his father's political instincts and administrative genius. His interests focus on alchemical experiments and artistic projects, rather than the detailed oversight that effective governance requires. The transition reveals how thoroughly the duchy had depended on one man's extraordinary capabilities, while demonstrating the difficulty of maintaining absolute monarchy across generations. The new Grand Duke's marriage to Joanna of Austria strengthens Habsburg connections, while his relationship with Bianca Capello creates scandals that damage ducal prestige. Court life becomes increasingly elaborate as artistic patronage serves personal pleasure rather than political calculation. Administrative efficiency declines as attention shifts from governmental details toward cultural pursuits that provide individual satisfaction but serve no larger purposes. These years mark the onset of economic decline, as shifting trade routes steer commerce toward the Atlantic and leave Italian ports behind. The commercial networks that had enriched earlier generations lose relevance as Spanish and Portuguese discoveries create new sources of wealth while reducing demand for traditional luxury goods. Banking operations contract as safer investments in agricultural land, provide steady returns without requiring the international expertise that had distinguished earlier family enterprises. Ferdinando I attempts to reverse decline when he assumes power in 1587, but discovers that restoring effective government requires skills that cannot be taught through formal education. His efforts to revive commerce succeed partially, while military reforms maintain Tuscan security against external threats. Yet the creative energy that had characterized his grandfather's reign proves impossible to recreate through mere administrative competence. As politics shift, so does society. Merchant families begin adopting aristocratic customs, while old nobles adjust to life within a bureaucratic system. Titles multiply as wealth converts into status through mechanisms that satisfy ambition while strengthening regime legitimacy. Yet social mobility decreases as positions become hereditary rather than merit-based, reducing opportunities for talented individuals while increasing privileges for those born into established families. Artistic achievement continues at high levels as patrons support projects that maintain Florence's reputation as cultural center while serving personal vanity rather than political objectives. The Medici collections grow through purchases that demonstrate wealth while preserving masterpieces for future generations. Museums begin emerging as private accumulations become public treasures, though access remains limited to those with appropriate social credentials. Bartolomeo Ammanati designs the facade of Santa Maria degli Angeli according to Counter-Reformation principles that emphasize emotional impact over classical restraint. His curved surfaces and dramatic lighting effects create spaces where worshippers experience divine presence through architectural manipulation of light and shadow. The project demonstrates how artists adapt Renaissance techniques to serve spiritual purposes that transcend mere aesthetic appreciation. Young men from noble families crowd into newly established academies, where professors trained in Roman law prepare them for careers in ducal service. Giovanni Battista Adriani teaches courses that emphasize practical application over theoretical speculation, ensuring that graduates understand exactly how governmental machinery functions. These students emerge as functionaries whose loyalty to the regime exceeds their commitment to independent thought. Merchants gather in guild halls where new regulations restrict their freedom to pursue international opportunities that might conflict with territorial priorities. The silk weavers discover that protective tariffs favor local production while limiting access to foreign markets that had once provided enormous profits. Innovation withers as entrepreneurs learn that security matters more than the risk-taking that had enriched their predecessors. Galileo conducts experiments in mechanics and astronomy while carefully avoiding conclusions that might challenge established doctrine. His investigations into falling bodies and planetary motion proceed within boundaries established by both political and clerical oversight. The brilliant mathematician understands that intellectual freedom operates only where inquiry serves approved purposes, rather than pursuing truth wherever it might lead. Princess Isabella de' Medici marries Paolo Giordano Orsini, Duke of Bracciano, in ceremonies that demonstrate the complete transformation from merchant origins to European nobility. The wedding contract specifies inheritance terms that protect Tuscan interests while creating alliances spanning multiple kingdoms. Their children will grow up speaking 4 languages while understanding that their primary loyalty belongs to the Grand Duchy that elevated their bloodline. Master gunners test new artillery pieces in foundries where metalworkers forge weapons according to the latest military specifications. These cannon can breach any fortification in Italy, while their crews train constantly to maintain professional standards that rival those of any European army. Yet the expense of maintaining such forces grows beyond what even efficient tax collection can sustain indefinitely. As the 16th century draws toward its close, Tuscany stands transformed from commercial republic into territorial monarchy. The Grand Duchy commands respect throughout Europe, while providing security and prosperity for its subjects. Yet the dynamic energy that had characterized earlier periods has been replaced by administrative competence that maintains existing achievements without creating new ones. The foundation has been laid for developments that will carry the dynasty through future centuries, while adapting to changed circumstances that no longer reward the entrepreneurial spirit that had created their original greatness. Florence has become the showroom of a crowned dynasty rather than the workshop of Renaissance innovation, its future determined by hereditary succession rather than commercial achievement. Silence fills the corridors of the Pitti Palace as Cosimo II de' Medici coughs blood into a silk handkerchief, his 30-year-old frame racked by the consumption that will end his reign before it truly begins. Through tall windows, he watches courtiers hurry across cobblestones wet with December rain, their whispered conversations carrying news of French victories and Spanish defeats that reshape European politics, while Tuscany drifts toward irrelevance. The fourth Grand Duke inherits territories larger than any his ancestors ruled, yet finds himself governing a realm whose influence contracts with each passing season. The young ruler's patronage of Galileo Galilei represents one final flowering of intellectual brilliance, in a court increasingly dominated by ceremony rather than substance. In chambers beneath the palace, the aging mathematician continues observations that revolutionize human understanding of cosmic movements, while navigating carefully around theological objections that could transform scientific inquiry into heretical investigation. His telescope reveals moons circling Jupiter and phases on Venus, discoveries that support heliocentric theories while challenging biblical interpretations that anchor traditional worldviews. But protection for controversial ideas weakens as Cosimo's health deteriorates and regency concerns override intellectual patronage. Maria Maddalena of Austria, the Grand Duchess mother, prioritizes religious orthodoxy over scientific advancement when her son dies in 1621, leaving 10-year-old Ferdinando II under guardianship that favors clerical advice over secular wisdom. Galileo finds himself increasingly isolated as supporters who might have defended his research focus instead on political survival within a court where power flows toward those who avoid controversy. Ferdinando II assumes personal leadership in 1628, with intelligence that unfortunately cannot overcome circumstances beyond any individual's control. European warfare drains Tuscan resources as the Duchy provides troops and supplies for campaigns that serve Habsburg interests rather than local welfare. The devastating plague of 1630 kills 1/3 of the population while destroying economic foundations that had sustained prosperity for generations. Recovery proceeds slowly as survivors struggle to rebuild communities shattered by demographic catastrophe. The Grand Duke attempts to revive intellectual life by establishing the Accademia del Cimento, Europe's first experimental academy dedicated to scientific investigation through controlled observation rather than philosophical speculation. Lorenzo Magalotti leads researchers who conduct careful experiments with barometric pressure, vacuum effects, and temperature variations that advance understanding of natural phenomena. Their published results influence scholars throughout Europe, while demonstrating that Tuscan intellect remains capable of significant achievement despite political decline. Yet even scientific success cannot disguise broader patterns of decay that affect every aspect of governance and society. International trade that once enriched Florentine merchants shifts toward Atlantic routes that bypass Mediterranean ports entirely. Banking operations contract as safer investments in agricultural estates, provide steady returns, without requiring the international expertise that had distinguished earlier family enterprises. The workshops that once produced luxury goods for European markets close as demand disappears, and artisans emigrate to regions offering better opportunities. Ferdinando's marriage to Vittoria della Rovere brings papal connections, but fails to produce the male heirs necessary for dynastic continuity. Their children include daughters whose marriages might create useful alliances, yet the absence of sons creates anxiety about succession that weakens governmental authority while encouraging potential rivals to position themselves for future opportunities. Court ceremonies become increasingly elaborate as external magnificence compensates for internal uncertainty. The Grand Duke's death in 1670 elevates Cosimo III de' Medici to leadership at a moment when effective governance might still reverse decades of decline. Unfortunately, the new ruler's obsessive religiosity and personal eccentricities prove catastrophically unsuited to the practical challenges facing his realm. His reign transforms the court from cultural center into a monastery, where rigid protocol stifles innovation, while excessive piety alienates subjects who prefer competent administration to sanctimonious lectures. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici represents the dynasty's last hope for revival through her marriage to Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine, which creates connections to German Protestant princes while maintaining Catholic orthodoxy at home. Her intelligence and diplomatic skill enable negotiations that protect Tuscan interests during the War of Spanish Succession, demonstrating that family talents persist despite unfavorable circumstances. Yet her childless marriage prevents the infusion of new blood that might revitalize the declining lineage. Prince Ferdinando de' Medici, Cosimo III's eldest son, shows promise as a patron who supports opera composers like Alessandro Scarlatti, while collecting paintings that demonstrate refined artistic judgment. His concerts at the Villa of Pratolino attract musicians from across Europe who perform works that blend Italian melody with international influences. Unfortunately, his father's disapproval of secular entertainment limits opportunities for cultural innovation, while personal conflicts poison relationships that might have supported artistic renaissance. The prince's death in 1713, without legitimate heirs, devastates succession plans, while revealing how completely the dynasty has failed to adapt to changing European realities. Gian Gastone de' Medici, the surviving son, displays intelligence that his peculiar lifestyle choices prevent him from applying effectively to governmental responsibilities. His reclusive habits and scandalous relationships create embarrassment that damages ducal prestige, while providing ammunition for critics who question whether hereditary monarchy serves any useful purpose. European powers begin negotiating Tuscan succession as if the ruling family no longer matters, their discussions revealing how thoroughly the Grand Duchy has become a pawn in larger diplomatic games. The War of Polish Succession provides opportunities for territorial redistribution that treats Italian states as rewards for victorious allies, rather than sovereign entities deserving respect. Habsburg and Bourbon claims compete, while ignoring local preferences that no longer carry weight in international calculations. Gian Gastone's accession in 1723 marks the beginning of the end, as the last male ruler demonstrates complete incompetence in every aspect of leadership. His court becomes notorious for debauchery that shocks even sophisticated observers accustomed to aristocratic excess. Administrative functions deteriorate as the Grand Duke spends days in bed, surrounded by young men whose qualifications for governmental service extend no further than their ability to provide personal entertainment. Amid the fading glory, Anna Maria Luisa moves with quiet determination to protect the artistic treasures that stand as the dynasty's crowning achievement. Her negotiations with European powers focus not on political survival, but on ensuring that artistic treasures accumulated over centuries remain in Florence, rather than dispersing to private collections throughout the continent. The agreements she secures will preserve paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that embody Renaissance genius for future generations who might better appreciate their value. The Electress Palatine walks daily through galleries where Botticelli's Venus rises from foam, where Michelangelo's David stands ready for battle, where Leonardo's notebooks preserve insights into human anatomy and mechanical engineering. Her conversations with curators and scholars focus on conservation techniques that will protect these masterpieces against time's ravages while ensuring public access that serves educational rather than merely decorative purposes. In the Laurentian Library, she oversees efforts to catalogue manuscripts that preserve classical texts, rescued from medieval oblivion by humanist scholars. Greek philosophical works, Latin historical chronicles, and Byzantine theological treatises fill shelves where future researchers will discover sources that illuminate both ancient wisdom and Renaissance recovery. Her foresight ensures that intellectual treasures survive political transitions that might otherwise scatter them beyond recovery. The Uffizi houses paintings whose value transcends monetary calculation, as Anna Maria Luisa establishes principles that will govern their preservation for centuries. Raphael's Madonnas, Titian's portraits, and Caravaggio's religious scenes represent artistic achievement that belongs to humanity rather than any individual collector. Her legal arrangements prevent their sale or removal, while creating institutional frameworks that will survive dynastic extinction. Workshops throughout the city continue producing luxury goods despite reduced demand, as craftsmen maintain traditions that connect them to ancestors who served earlier generations of patrons. Pietradura artists create intricate stone mosaics using techniques perfected under Grand Ducal patronage. Goldsmiths fashion jewelry that demonstrates technical skill inherited through family workshops spanning multiple centuries. Their products find fewer buyers but preserve knowledge that might prove valuable when prosperity returns. Even with fewer resources, religious groups persist in their charitable work, supporting communities burdened by economic decline. Monasteries continue operating schools that provide education for children whose families cannot afford private instruction. Hospitals treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, while relying on endowments established during more prosperous periods. These foundations demonstrate how earlier generosity creates lasting benefits that transcend the political circumstances of their creation. The countryside surrounding Florence reveals both decay and persistence, as agricultural estates struggle with reduced labor forces while maintaining production that feeds urban populations. Villa gardens, designed by Renaissance architects, require constant maintenance that current resources cannot adequately support. Terraced hillsides carved from hillsides over generations slowly revert to wilderness as families abandon marginal lands in favor of more productive areas. Diplomatic correspondence between European capitals discusses Tuscan succession with casual indifference to local preferences or traditional rights. The Treaty of Vienna in 1735 assigns the Grand Duchy to Francis Stephen of Lorraine as compensation for territories he surrenders to France in exchange for imperial succession rights. The agreement treats Tuscany like a commodity whose transfer requires no consultation with inhabitants who must accept whatever arrangements serve broader strategic purposes. Jean Gaston's final years pass in alcoholic stupor, while real governance falls to ministers who attempt to maintain basic administrative functions, despite their rulers' complete abdication of responsibility. Tax collection continues sporadically, while law courts operate according to precedents established during more competent reigns. The machinery of state functions through bureaucratic momentum rather than active leadership. The Grand Duke's death in July 1737 occurs without ceremony, appropriate to the end of a dynasty that had shaped European culture for nearly 3 centuries. No crowds gather to mourn his passing, while foreign troops prepare to occupy strategic positions throughout Tuscan territory. The transformation from family estate to foreign possession proceeds according to international agreements that treat inhabitants as subjects whose opinions matter less than diplomatic convenience. Anna Maria Luisa faces the final extinction of her bloodline with dignity that honors ancestors whose achievements will outlast any political arrangements. Her meetings with Francis Stephen focus on ensuring continuity for institutions that preserve cultural heritage while adapting to changed circumstances. The negotiations result in formal agreements that legally bind artistic collections to Florentine territory, regardless of future governmental changes. The Pact of 1737 represents her greatest achievement as it establishes permanent protection for treasures that represent humanity's artistic heritage, rather than merely family possessions. Legal language, crafted by international lawyers, creates obligations that transcend individual ownership, while ensuring public access that serves educational purposes. Future rulers of whatever nationality must respect arrangements that preserve Renaissance masterpieces for scholars and visitors from throughout the world. October 1737 witnesses Francis Stephen's arrival in Florence as foreign soldiers maintain order during the transition from hereditary dynasty to appointed governance. Citizens observe these changes with emotions ranging from curiosity to resignation, as they adapt once again to new forms of authority that promise stability while eliminating local autonomy. The experiment in family rule that began with Giovanni de' Bicci's banking innovations ends with bureaucratic efficiency that prioritizes order over creativity. Anna Maria Luisa retires to her apartments in the Pitti Palace, where she spends remaining years cataloguing treasures while corresponding with scholars who seek access to collections she has preserved. Her salon attracts intellectuals from across Europe who recognize her contributions to cultural conservation, while respecting her dignity in accepting circumstances beyond her control. She becomes the guardian of memory in a city that must discover new purposes for its accumulated heritage. The apartments where Lorenzo, the Magnificent, once hosted Renaissance luminaries, now house a solitary woman whose conversations span centuries of achievement while acknowledging present limitations. Portraits of ancestors who built commercial empires and patronized artistic genius line walls where she walks each evening, remembering stories passed down through generations while preparing accounts that will guide future custodians of their legacy. Libraries that once attracted humanist scholars from throughout Europe continue serving researchers who arrive seeking access to texts preserved through careful stewardship. The reading rooms echo with whispered discussions as visitors from German universities, French academies, and English colleges examine manuscripts that illuminate both classical antiquity and Renaissance recovery. Knowledge flows outward from Florence, even as political influence contracts toward insignificance. Workshops maintain traditional crafts despite reduced patronage, as masters train apprentices in techniques that represent centuries of accumulated skill. Young men learn to carve marble using methods perfected by artists who served earlier generations of rulers. The knowledge persists through institutional memory that transcends individual careers, while preserving capabilities that might prove valuable when circumstances change. Churches throughout the city display artworks that transform sacred spaces into galleries where visitors encounter masterpieces created during periods of greater prosperity and confidence. Fra Angelico's frescoes continue inspiring devotion, while Brunelleschi's architecture demonstrates mathematical harmony made manifest in stone. The spiritual and aesthetic heritage survives political transitions that affect governance without diminishing artistic achievement. Anna Maria Luisa's death in 1743 marks the complete extinction of the main Medician line, while ensuring the preservation of their greatest contributions to human culture. Her funeral attracts representatives from courts throughout Europe, who recognize her success in protecting artistic heritage that belongs to all humanity rather than any single nation. The ceremonies honor both personal dignity and institutional achievement that will influence cultural preservation for centuries. The dynasty that rose through banking genius, flourished through political wisdom, and achieved immortality through artistic patronage, leaves behind monuments more durable than kingdoms. Their palaces house treasures that inspire future generations, while their libraries preserve knowledge that enriches human understanding. The family tomb holds bodies that have returned to dust, but their legacy lives on in beauty they created and wisdom they preserved. Florence adapts to foreign governance while maintaining cultural institutions that define its identity independently of political arrangements. The workshops, academies, and collections continue serving purposes that transcend any individual regime, while attracting visitors who seek connection to Renaissance achievement. The city that had been shaped by one extraordinary family discovers how to preserve its character, while serving new masters who respect inherited traditions. Night falls over the Arno as shadows lengthen across bridges where merchants once carried goods from 3 continents. The river flows unchanged, while political arrangements transform according to European diplomatic requirements that treat Italian states as assets rather than sovereignties. Yet in galleries where masterpieces hang in perpetual splendor, the true monument to family greatness persists beyond any temporal authority. The line did not break with violence, but withered quietly, elegantly, and without airs, leaving Florence to remember them in stone and fresco, in marble statues and painted ceilings, in libraries that preserve ancient wisdom and galleries that display immortal beauty. They rose like bankers, ruled like kings, and faded like legends, but their age lives on wherever human eyes encounter beauty and human minds engage with truth they helped preserve for eternity.